All right. We're just gonna start off like this. Just if you want to share your name, what you do, where you're from, or where you're at, go ahead.
All right. Well, my name is Austin Roberts. I am from just up the road here in Loma Linda, California. I currently am a full-time MDiv student at Fuller Theological Seminary, and I also do some pastoral intern work with Praxis, which is the young adult group at the Loma Linda University Church.
Okay. And so, you been working as a full-time pastor? Like, have you done that yet, or have you been doing that like before this? Like, what's been that?
Yeah, so when I completed my bachelor's degree in 2015, I took a job as an associate at the Sunnyvale Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is located in Sunnyvale, California. And if you're not familiar with the geography of California, that's like between San Jose and San Francisco.
Okay, up north.
Yeah.
Okay, and so
yeah, 3 years there, and then I got married and went back to school.
so when you were pastoring, something I love to ask pastors just to get that raw answer. What was your favorite part? What was the hardest part of pastoring, or even now that you're still pastoring?
Yeah, good question. I think I would say that if I had to choose a favorite or a couple of favorite parts about pastoring, I would say that my experience overall with my coworkers, bosses, and so forth was very positive. And I know that that's not always the case for everybody, but that has been the case for me thus far. That's not to say it's been perfect, but I had a really good work experience just within the context of a church. Along with that, the congregation, the people who attended both here in Loma Linda and up at Sunnyvale were wonderful people, honestly. They were, great people, had a really good time interacting with them. I also tend to enjoy kind of the discipline of preaching and some of the more administratively minded tasks. Things that were tough. Conflict resolution, I think, is tough. I think my ability to resolve conflict has grown a lot in the past 5-6 years or so, and it has not always been as good. So there are moments where that has been pretty tough, but hopefully I have grown and learned from those moments.
Yeah. What was it that kind of was your spark step to want to do ministry? Because, I think the question I don't want to ask is what was how did you know you were called? Because I think that's such an interesting term that people use, especially in religious settings or pastoral settings where we were called, and that makes it seem like nothing else is a calling. But what made you want to become a pastor going down that path?
Yeah, another good question. That is a bit of a tough one for me because, you briefly mentioned the idea of being called, and I've never felt one single moment in life where it's been I can point to that or that or that or whatever and say that was the moment where I felt like I was called. It's more been kind of a slow burn, if you will, or kind of a lifetime of feeling that desire. So I grew up in the home of a pastor, and that was a very positive experience. Again, not something that can be said for everyone who grew up in that setting. And just throughout those growing up years, it was something I looked to or looked up to and perceived it in a very positive light. Then through high school and college, I think the desire to go into ministry was strengthened, particularly in college, just through positive experiences with, I think, members of the faculty, fellow students, and just doing things I enjoyed there. So maybe not the answer that a lot of people might expect in terms of pointing to a single moment or single calling, but it's just something that's always kind of been there.
Yeah. Well, so along those lines, I actually want you to unpack something. Something I'd like to ask everybody that comes on this podcast is, what was it that you did that you began to become intentional about your relationship with Jesus? In the sense of, especially you grew up in a home of a pastor, and so you were always surrounded, I guess, by Christianity, by Adventism, by Jesus. And so when did you become intentional? This is something I want to do, and I want to be take a hold of myself along the way, every day myself, not just because of the routine that's available to me.
Yeah, I think I would say that experience grew more, probably in college and even a little later, the desire to kind of learn and experience both kind of a personal spirituality and then kind of diving more into some doctrinal things, whether they were Adventist or otherwise, and just trying to learn, trying to understand, and trying to have a personal relationship with Jesus in a way that was modeled over people who are older and wiser than I, but also kind of a discovery experience and learning and seeing things that I can do and I could do on my own. I would also probably point to my experience at Fuller as a non-Adventist institution and say that learning from people who come from different traditions and experiences has been a very helpful thing for me. That's something that I don't think is an opportunity that's always afforded to everyone. Or on the other hand, it's a reality that people don't always take advantage of when they can. And that has been kind of a deconstructive and reconstructive experience at times. So I've enjoyed that a lot.
Yeah. I can feel it off you that you're a scholar. And so what I want to ask about is in your approach of like in Jesus, because a lot of people's revelation about God has been very emotional or very, like you don't need to go to school, etc., or do these things that people, and some people are okay with that. But I can tell that you appreciate the knowledge behind it all. Just from even just, I'm just sitting here with you. How has that been in your in pastoral ministry, but also in your relationship with God? Like, because also you've mentioned to me how the more you've learned makes you realize the little that you know. How has that journey been?
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, I would say. No doubt about that. If I were to kind of break it down probably into one or two or three maybe different areas, I would say this. First, the journey has been not always what I expected. And I want to say, as a bit of a disclaimer before I get into it, that regardless of the knowledge or the reading or the understanding that I have accomplished up to this point, nothing can really replace the work of the Holy Spirit, I would say. And so when I speak with other people who might disagree with me, and especially other people who might not be as theologically educated or understanding, I want to be very careful not to kind of high road somebody and say, well, I know this because I've studied this, and you don't know this because you haven't studied this. Because the truth is, the work of the Holy Spirit works in and through anyone, or it can work in and through anyone, and, far be it for me to put that down just because I have studied a little bit more. So that being said, I think that one of the biggest portions of that journey and understanding of some of our own deeper doctrinal and theological beliefs has come through the fact that the grand majority of the people who I interact with, especially from like a faculty perspective, are Reformed. And that's very different than what we understand in Adventism. And to kind of unpack that a little bit, we are, Arminian in our theology, so we believe in the freedom of choice. Do you choose Jesus or do you choose something else? And that's really important to us as Adventists, and it's important to other traditions as well. But the Reformed tradition and the Calvinist tradition doesn't believe that. They believe in the idea of predestination, and they believe in, total depravity and irresistible grace, and the fact that God's grace and power is so great that we cannot choose. Therefore, you are part of the predestined or the elect to heaven, or the reprobate or the damned to hell. And that's kind of been an interesting journey because we don't really talk about that as Adventists. And now I go to school at a place where we talk about that a lot, much more than I have ever interacted with it before. And there are parts of that that I really deeply appreciate, but there are also parts of that I have sincere issues with. To talk about one of the things that I really do appreciate a lot is that idea of irresistible grace and total depravity. And because we believe in the freedom of choice, I don't think we always really appreciate the idea of grace kind of fully through to its realization, because we say, well, you can choose to have it or you can choose to not. Whereas as someone who's reformed would say, well, we as human beings are totally depraved. We have nothing and can do nothing without the grace of Jesus. So they would say, if you have been elect, part of, those who are predestined to heaven, you have been given a gift that is so great in grace that it cannot be refused. It is irresistible. And that is the power that grace holds. And you'll never meet a Calvinist who is afraid of hell, really, because they're so confident, one, in their own sinfulness, but two, in the grace of Jesus to shine through that and work its saving power in their life. And I don't think we always understand that or realize that. We have, I don't know, we have kind of a roadblock there sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think that idea of irresistible grace and that power is really important. And that freedom of choice, while I think it's a real thing, puts us kind of in a different paradigm.
Yeah.
And we don't always appreciate it perhaps as much as we could or as much as we should.
I think because of the choice that we present, we can always scared of making the wrong choice. And so even though we believe that grace exists, exactly like you said, we always have this fear that I might make a choice out of the grace one day, at any time.
Yeah.
Maybe accidentally, maybe in just right before I die, I might make a bad mistake. Or the same way we feel I remember as a kid, I'd always be like, well, even if I'm sinful, right when I'm about to die, if I die at old age, I just be like, God, I choose you. Okay, I'm good. Right? And then so, and I don't know where that comes from in Adventism. I don't know if you've learned anything. Why do you think that we kind of teach in this way that allows us to be scared?
Yeah, so I think this is a problem that we find in Adventism a lot, like you just mentioned. And we as Adventists, I obviously believe in our doctrinal and our theological ideas and so forth, but depending on which corners of the church you reach into, sometimes you'll find things that I would disagree with. So to kind of answer that question, what I would say is that our theology of sin and grace, particularly when you get into a really, really kind of problematically conservative corner of the church, what you'll find is that there's theological ideas and beliefs there that aren't really consistent with mainstream Adventism or with what I would believe. And one of those ideas is a heresy that has, long since really died out in kind of mainstream Christianity called Pelagianism. And Pelagianism is derived from Pelagius, the first person or first man who kind of talked about this and made this more mainstream during his day and time, which was, in the early church. And his theological idea was basically related to the idea of human nature. And you can, Google it, read about it. The Wikipedia page on it is actually great. But to kind of put it in a sentence or two, he would basically say that our nature as human beings doesn't include original sin, therefore we are not sinful in nature. So sin then becomes something we do, not something we are. And the issue with that is, particularly in Adventism, you'll find people who say, well, if you don't sin, if you, can manage to live a perfect life, repent of your previous sins and then live a perfect life, then you end up with salvation. That's where we end up with some problematic Adventist specific ideas like last generation theology and the way certain people treat the remnant. Yeah. And I think that becomes a real problem Because then with these people, what you'll find is that the need for Jesus severely diminishes.
That's right. You can do it yourself.
Right, because you can then do it yourself. And that's a problem because you can't do it yourself. Again, I would say that sin is not something you do. It is someone you are. It is part of your nature. And the bad things that we all inevitably do at some point or another are just outgrowths of that sinful nature. A question that I've discussed at times, and I'm sure others have discussed too, is like the idea of, think of a child, newborn baby, who dies in infancy due to whatever circumstance. Is that child in need of Jesus still because they haven't actually sinned? And the answer to that is yes, the child is still sinful in nature, despite the fact that it never grew old enough to be able to reason in that way and to be able to sin. The child is still damned to hell without the saving grace of Jesus Christ. And that, that I think is where that idea comes from, as you described it and how I would describe it as well in my own childhood, is, what if you sin and then you die? You don't have an opportunity to repent and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, this is the sin I've committed." And that's really unfortunate because, I just don't think it works that way.
Yeah, it leaves us in fear.
Yeah.
I think it's so hard because there's so much of our salvation that we think we have to work out ourselves.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's like a control thing or it's easier to teach just so that you can make sure people are falling into line, and maybe because if you make it an action thing, you can just tell people, hey, stop doing that as a group. Don't do that because you're good, or don't do this or start doing this because it might create some sort of uniformity, I guess. And I don't know why it's like that, but yeah, it's. I think there's such a freedom in what you're talking about when we understand that it might be not an action thing, but an identity thing that Jesus came and died for to save us from. I have a question also. In your experience now in seminary and learning so much from other, I guess, disciplines and denominations, etc., how do you deal with knowing that there's so much other knowledge that exists outside of Adventism and while staying Adventist? I think sometimes some people face this when they see that another group has truth or understanding of God and it's not harmful or it's not scary. Sometimes that might be make people think I got to get out of mine because growing up, I remember hearing terms like remnant and we're the last ones. And I remember even seeing my friends sometimes and being man, they're all lost unless they become SCA, right? But then I've come to realize that that's not the case, and it's so much more, right? And there's so much more. So how do we deal with that balance of knowing that other people have understanding of God, but I also know I want to stay in my context of that.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think that you could ask 10, 100 different people who are in a similar situation that I'm in, and you would get 100 different answers. People treat it very differently. In my own personal experience, I think my interaction with other traditions, other backgrounds, experiences, denominations, and so forth, has really strengthened my journey within my own tradition. And I know that's not always the case for everybody, but there are a couple of reasons why I think that is. One, there's this idea that the grass is always greener on the other side. And let me tell you, that is not true. We certainly have problems within our denomination and local churches. We have issues that we don't deal with very well. We have things we won't even talk about for a variety of reasons. And it is the same no matter where you go. The issues and the problems might change, but kind of the underlying fact remains the same. No matter where you go, that's going to be the case. And that's just the reality of human nature. And that's just what happens when people organize into a religion and denomination. You're going to run into problems. But secondly, the way I think that I perceive Adventist theology in contrast to other theological ideas and beliefs is that I would say that through my own period of study and learning and seeing different things, I think the way that we interpret and perceive the Bible is correct in many ways. That's not to say that we're right about everything, because I don't think we are. And, I pray to God that we and that I never become so arrogant and full of my own ideas that I become blind to other things and other places where I can learn and other sources of truth and knowledge. Because while I believe we're right about a lot of things, I believe we're also wrong in places. And then I think the last thing I would say is we have like certain specific Adventist beliefs, right? Most of our beliefs we share with someone somewhere, but there are a few things that are pretty unique to us. But those are becoming less and less unique. If we think about things like the Sabbath or the state of the dead, our beliefs in the nature of hell or our health message and stuff like that, a lot of those things used to be really uniquely Adventist. That is becoming way less true. We in seminary, we talk about Sabbath all the time, and it's not quite in the same way that we would perceive it as Adventists, but I read and I hear about it constantly. It's the same with, hell and annihilationism and our belief that hell isn't a place that'll burn forever and we'll be, or those who end up there will be tortured. We don't believe that. We believe in kind of an immediate annihilation of people who end up choosing that path. And that's another belief that is becoming more and more widespread.
Wow.
And it's just fascinating for me to see these kinds of things. And also a little bit sad, because we're not very ecumenical in nature. We don't always play nice with other traditions. And that's too bad, because I think while other traditions have a lot to offer to us, we also have a lot to offer, particularly in the way of the Sabbath. The Sabbath for so long has been really an idea of, we talk about rules and regulations. We do this, and we do that, and we can't do this, and we can't do that. But the truth is, the Sabbath was originally a commandment that was given to the Israelites really as an idea of social justice. They'd been slaves for 400 years, and they didn't understand the concept and the idea of rest and how to take a break. And so God made it a law, and he said, you will rest because you need it. And many of the other Levitical laws you can look at in kind of the same light. And we have really, unfortunately, turned those into rules. But,
So you've found ways to, while obviously humbly and understanding that there's knowledge everywhere, but to take pride or be, there's not something to be ashamed of, to be Adventist amongst everything else.
Certainly.
That's amazing. Also, just thank you again for your time. Thank you for sharing on this and unpacking this. If there's somebody who's listening that's, seeking to know more about God, but sometimes is weary of the context, or just, maybe just scared of stepping out, but because there's so much, sometimes I don't know, it's taboo to learn from other sources that are outside the church or other sources that are outside Adventism. What would you say to encourage them just to learn more, to read things that aren't just by Adventist writers, to learn from places that aren't just Adventist circles?
Yeah, that can be a tough road for many. And that's a good question. I think, man, if I were to recommend something to someone who is interested in learning, there's, a wealth of knowledge out there. Obviously, there's, many, many things that one could read or listen to, but I would encourage someone who is interested in learning maybe to read John Stott, the late, great English theologian and scholar. He's a great place to start. He, is incredibly well educated, but he writes in a way that is easy to understand, easy to kind of think about, and it's not so scholarly and heady that you can't unpack it. So that's probably a place where I would start. But also I would encourage someone to just ask questions. Hopefully they're in a context or in a place where a pastor or a mentor is willing to answer those questions, or at least willing to point them in a direction where they can, have some honest discussion. Thank you so much for having me, Ben. I have really enjoyed
love
this time that we've spent together.
Yeah.
And it's been wonderful for me.
Thank you. Thank you. Awesome.